Session 5 has to do with the broker's agency policies. I think the first thing that we need to make a comment about is that some time ago we had a policy called dual agency, and that's where a broker was allowed to represent both the buyer and the seller in a single agent capacity. They found that that didn't work, so dual agency was repealed, and it was replaced with three types of agency: single agent, transaction brokerage, and the no brokerage relationship. And along with those relationships that we have, there's certain disclosures that have to be made. And let's make sure that we understand these disclosures only relate to residential transactions. And by definition, a residential transaction would be up to 4 units, or a piece of vacant land that could be built on up to 4 units. And also agricultural properties that are 10 acres or less, those are considered to be residential properties. Non-residential properties do not require these disclosures. And when we get down to the types of agency that we have, the three types, the first one is the no brokerage relationship. And what this basically has is the minimum requirements of dealing openly, honestly, and fairly, disclosing all late material defects, and depositing money in escrow according to rules. This is the one agency that does not have skill, care, and diligence, which could lead to culpable negligence. The single agent, on the other hand, has all of the fiduciary duties, dealing with loyalty. And loyalty means you've got to look out for your client's best interest. Confidentiality, obedience, full disclosure. And full disclosure means both facts and rumors. And it also has skill, care, and diligence as well. And remember that there's a single agent disclosure form that has to be given out either prior to showing property or prior to contracting, and typically that's a listing contract. The no brokerage relationship also has a disclosure form, and that has to be done prior to closing. So they're both very similar. The one that does not require a disclosure form is the transaction brokerage relationship. In the state of Florida, you are presumed to be a transaction broker unless you enter into an agreement otherwise. It's the most common practice. The transaction brokerage relationship obviously has limited representation. And the reason that it's the most popular is that it allows brokers to work with both the buyer and the seller at the same time. The single agent relationship, you can't. You can't be a single agent for the buyer and the seller at the same time. There's a conflict. You can't look out for the buyer's best interest and the seller's best interest at the same time. Transaction brokerage doesn't do that. Single agent says that you work for them in their best interest. Transaction broker says that you simply are representing them as a facilitator. So there's a huge difference in terms of the way that you represent somebody. Also, I think it's important that you note that as far as transaction brokerage, when you're dealing with both the buyer and seller in-house, that you can't tilt, that you can't say or do anything that would be disadvantageous to the other or put them in a lesser position of negotiating. If a broker decides they want to transition from a single agent relationship to a transaction broker, they can certainly do it. But there is a form that has to be filled out and signed. It's typically done when we take the listing contract. It's called a consent to transition to transaction brokerage. This is the only form that must be signed and retained in the office. And that brings me to another thing. The other forms that we have, these other disclosure forms, are informational only. No signature is required. It's simply letting people know how we're representing their interest. The termination of agency relationship, there's a number of ways that we can terminate agency relationships. Performance, mutual agreement, expiration of the contract, obviously. And let me make a comment about the revocation by the principal. A seller may have the ability to be able to cancel a listing contract. They may have the power. They can take your sign and rip it up, rip the contract up, but they may not necessarily have the legal authority. Unless the broker has breached the contract, a seller cannot arbitrarily terminate a listing contract. And also the last thing is bankruptcy by the principal. If your customer or client files bankruptcy, the trustees of the bankruptcy court take over the property and your agreement has been terminated. And that's all we have for Session 5 on the broker's agency policy. What I'd like to do right now, I'd like to review with you that information, those areas of critical concern. Written disclosures only apply to residential transactions. The no brokerage relationship does not offer skill, care, and diligence. The single agent disclosure has to be delivered either prior to showing or prior to entering into a contract, whichever comes first. The consent to transition from single agent to transaction broker is the only disclosure form that has to be signed by the client. Bankruptcy by the client can terminate a listing and their agency relationship. And that's all we have for the agency relationship section.